Hello, and welcome to The Psychology of Murder, a podcast by Keisha Wilson. Today, we will be covering our very first case, the dating game killer. Everyone loves a good dating show, right? The Bachelor and Bachelorette wouldn't be nearly as popular as they are if they didn't. But can you imagine winning a date with a serial killer? My sources for today are coming from multiple online sources, which will be listed in the description below, including the DSM-5 and ABC's 2020 Season 43, Episode 9. Unfortunately, one of my sources for this episode is Wikipedia. There wasn't a lot of reading material on this case, but I started with my other sources first and colored in some of the details from the Wikipedia article. There were a lot of mistakes in this article that I noticed, but I tried to pick through it to the best of my ability. My reporting skills are only as good as my resources, and I try to bring you the most accurate information possible. Warning: this episode contains themes of sexual assault and violence. Listener discretion is advised. Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Buquar, also known as Rodney Alcala, was born in San Antonio, Texas on August 23, 1943. In 1951, Alcala's father moved the family to Mexico and proceeded to abandon them 3 years later. His mother moved the family, including Rodney and his two sisters, to Los Angeles in 1954. Outside of being abandoned by his father, Alcala had a relatively normal upbringing. While I couldn't find a lot of details about his childhood outside of what I previously mentioned, it was reported to be a good childhood, without some of the traumatic upbringings you see from serial killers occasionally. When Alcala turned 17 in 1961, he joined the U.S. Army as a clerk. 3 years later, in 1964, Alcala had what was assumed to be a nervous breakdown, during which he went AWOL and hitchhiked back to his mother's house. During this time, he was diagnosed with severe, chronic, antisocial personality disorder by a military psychiatrist and was honorably discharged on medical grounds. Now, if you'll remember from our previous episode, being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder is essentially being diagnosed as a psychopath. If anybody out there is counting red flags, that would be red flag number 1. After being discharged from the Army, Alcala attended and graduated from UCLA as a photography student. He was well liked by his teachers and fellow students and did not appear to have any issues during this time. Rodney Alcala committed his first known crime in Los Angeles on September 25, 1968. He lured an 8-year-old girl, Tally Shapiro, into his vehicle and took her to his apartment in Hollywood to, quote, look at a poster, end quote. Alcala claimed he was a friend of Shapiro's parents, and not wanting to appear rude to her elders, she obliged and got into the car. Luckily, there was an eyewitness to Shapiro getting into the vehicle. He thought the situation looked suspicious and followed Alcala in his car back to his apartment. It was then the eyewitness called the police. But by the time the police had arrived, the damage had already been done. When the police came knocking, Alcala shouted through the door that he had just gotten out of the shower and was naked, and asked for a few moments to put on some clothes. The officer, knowing something was off, busted open the door, where Alcala was standing naked but dry. In the kitchen, the officer saw a horrific scene. There was blood everywhere. More blood than should have been able to come out of a little 8-year-old girl. Shapiro lay on the ground, bleeding out, nearly strangled with a heavy metal pipe around her neck, nearly dead. The ambulance was already on the way and arrived to take Shapiro to the hospital, where she was in a coma for 32 days. She should not have survived, but miraculously, she did. During Shapiro's interview with ABC's 2020, she mentioned her family never talked about what happened to her that day. They tried to pretend it never happened, but they couldn't escape the news coverage, so they moved to Mexico, which would end up being a problem for Alcala's prosecution in the case later. But I also feel bad for what happened after the attack. Not being allowed to talk about what happened to her would not be beneficial for her healing and coping. I'm not trying to judge her parents because what they went through was traumatic also, but Shapiro should have been put in therapy. I hope this is something that she received later as an adult and has been able to work through her trauma. While waiting for the ambulance, the officer had a choice to make. Did he stay with the girl and perform life-saving measures, or did he chase after the man who had committed the crime? He could only choose one. He chose to stay with the girl, calling for the other officer with him to give chase to Alcala. However, the other officer misunderstood and thought the primary officer was calling for his assistance, allowing Alcala to escape through the back door, where the other officer had been posted mere moments before. This was just one of the many instances where Alcala could have and should have been apprehended and kept in prison, but managed to escape. This is a theme that you will unfortunately see repeated throughout this case. I should note here that there was a significant amount of pornography found in Alcala's house, both of young women and boys. I find this interesting because serial killers and rapists usually stick to one victim type, but we'll talk about this a little bit more later. In an attempt to avoid the warrant out for his arrest, Alcala fled to New York, where he enrolled at the NYU Film School under the alias of John Berger, Berger. This is important for later. Alcala remained undetected there for several years. This was a time in New York City where there was an inordinate amount of crime, so it was easy for Alcala to fly under the radar. Alcala committed his next known crime in June of 1971, the murder of a 23-year-old flight attendant, Cornelia Criley. There were some conflicting reports online about where in the timeline this actually occurred, whether it was before, after, or even during his time at his next hideout, but I decided to put the crime here. She was found raped and strangled by her own stockings in her Manhattan apartment. Her case actually remained unsolved until 2011, with Alcala pleading guilty in 2012. Also in 1971, Alcala moved to New Hampshire to take a job as a counselor at an art camp in the state. This time he used the name John Berger, Burger. Yeah, real creative guy, I know. It was during this time that the FBI placed Rodney Alcala on their list of 10 most wanted fugitives. This list happened to be posted at a post office near the camp, where two campers recognized the photo as John Berger and told the camp's dean. Alcala was then ratted out and extradited to California for his crimes against Shapiro. Because Shapiro was still in Mexico at this point, and because her parents would not allow her to, she did not testify against Alcala. Without the prosecution's star witness, Alcala was allowed to take a plea deal to the lesser charge of child molestation, where he was sentenced to 3 years. But he was released in 34 months on good behavior. Can you believe that? This man almost murdered an 8-year-old girl, and he was let out after 34 months on good behavior. This is just one of the many examples during this case where Alcala showcases part of his antisocial personality disorder. Remember from our first episode, in this case, antisocial does not mean anti-people. It literally means against society. Alcala was reportedly able to read people very well and stay multiple steps ahead of everyone. Someone even mentioned that, quote, it was like a chess game to him, end quote. He was able to convince the parole board to let him go because they thought he was a changed man. Well, as we're about to see, they thought wrong. With Alcala's history of sexual assault, he was interviewed by the California police as a suspect for the Hillside Strangler killings. Alcala was cleared of those murders, and the police were none the wiser that they had been speaking with a different serial killer. Somewhere in here, in this admittedly mess of a timeline, Alcala was rearrested on a marijuana charge and given 2.5 years in jail. Let me remind you that he was only given 3 years previously for the child molestation charges against Shapiro. However, his parole officer allowed Alcala, a known flight risk and repeat offender, to travel to New York City. What the heck, parole officer? It is believed that within a week of arriving again in New York City, he murdered 23-year-old Ellen Hover, the daughter of the owner of a popular Hollywood nightclub, Ciro's. Now, I'm sure you guys are beginning to wonder where the dating game from The Dating Game Killer comes from. Well, here it is. Created in 1965 by Chuck Barris, The Dating Game was a game show where one woman would be sitting on one side of a wall, while 3 men were sitting on the other side of the wall, being asked questions by the woman. The idea was that the woman would choose someone based on their answers to the questions and not by looks. She would not get to see the men until after she had made her choice, and the man she chose won a date with her. This show had a long run, spanning from 1965 to 1986. Our man Alcala made his appearance on the show in September of 1978. If the show had run a background check, they would have discovered he was a convicted child molester and a registered sex offender. But it was the 70s, and they didn't do background checks for things like this. I imagine today you can't even get onto The Price is Right without a background check. I don't know if that's actually true, but it sounds like something they would require. They introduced Alcala as, quote, a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in the darkroom at the age of 13, fully developed, end quote. Whatever the heck that means. I thought his father left well before he was 13, so it's likely that the story isn't even true. Being the psychopathic charmer he was, Alcala ended up winning the date with the woman, Cheryl Bradshaw, with his wit and innuendos. When Bradshaw asked what kind of meal he would be, which, by the way, what kind of question is that? That's just asking for creepy answers. His response was, quote, "I'm called the banana, and I look really good. Peel me," end quote. Ugh, gag. After Bradshaw had made her decision, the two of them met face to face. Bradshaw was smart enough to sense something was off with him, calling Alcala creepy, and she refused to go out on the date he had so rightfully earned. Eye roll. Criminal profiler Pat Brown later noted that Alcala killed at least 3 women pretty quickly after his appearance on the dating game, and speculated that the rejection he faced was a determining factor for those murders. Rejection and/or incompletion of rituals can often send a serial killer off on a rage. An example of this is with Jack the Ripper. When he did not get the chance to properly dismember his victim, he quickly found another one the same night to complete the ritual. Serial killers don't understand rejection, Brown said. They think something is wrong with the girl, not themselves. Alcala was tall and good-looking. He told people he was a photographer and was looking for women to take photos of for contests, which should be another red flag right there. Ladies, if a man in particular, comes up asking to take photos of you, don't do it. He was intelligent and charming, something you can often see in psychopaths, such as Ted Bundy and H.H. Holmes. Those are probably 2 of my favorite references for psychopaths, in case you haven't noticed by now. One woman who narrowly missed a date with Alcala because he was arrested yet again, red flag, said that he was easy to trust and could talk to people in a way that put them at ease. Alcala was arrested yet again for the final time on July 24th, 1979 for the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Robin Somso in Huntington Beach, California. It was Alcala's parole officer that turned him in based on a sketch that had been released in the case. I'm not sure if this was the same parole officer who allowed Alcala to go to New York City on vacation, but I'd like to think it was, and he was getting his revenge for Alcala making him look bad. However, now that I think about it, that case wasn't solved until 2011, so that is likely not the case. But a girl can dream. Alcala was convicted of the charges in the Somso case in 1980, but the conviction was overturned 4 years later because the jury had been improperly informed of Alcala's criminal record. I'm not sure if that means they weren't told everything on his record or if they lied about something on his record, but people can get off on the smallest technicalities. So, they held a second trial in 1986, which resulted in a second guilty verdict that was also later overturned in 2001 on another technicality. During this time, Alcala wrote a book called You the Jury in 1994, arguing that he was innocent. I feel like this is such a psychopathic, manipulative move on his part. The most annoying thing is, he probably gained some sympathizers from his book because he was so good at manipulating people. Some posited during his trials that Alcala had narcissistic personality disorder and/or borderline personality disorder. I'll go into those diagnoses in a later episode, but I can definitely see narcissistic personality disorder at the very least. Anyway, so Alcala was retried again in 2010, this time with some DNA evidence linking Alcala to other crimes to back them up. The prosecution relied heavily this time on a pair of gold earrings that had been found in one of Alcala's storage lockers, which was linked to the Somso case. In an attempt to refute this, as well as likely an attempt to show the jury how charming he really was, Alcala played clips from his episode on the dating game, claiming this proved he was already wearing the same earrings in 1978 before the murder he was being accused of. Really? Is this guy for real? You and I both know the quality of television in the 1970s was not great. I highly doubt you would have been able to see these alleged earrings well enough to properly identify them through the TV anyway. And also, what an attention seeker. Only Alcala could find a way to bring his television debut to the courtroom and use it as a defense. But thankfully, the jury did not see through his antics and convicted Alcala of the murder of Samso for a third and hopefully final time. Unfortunately, there are just too many murders for me to go into detail with in this case. Estimates put Alcala's death toll range anywhere from 50 to 130 people, as evidenced by some of the explicit pictures found in Alcala's home and storage locker, along with those golden earrings. The police made some of these images public in an attempt to identify some of the victims, and multiple people did come forward from this. But I feel bad for the victims who had their images shared. The police said they kept the most explicit ones to themselves, but it had to have been humiliating all the same. A co-worker of Alcala's from the Los Angeles Times, as his short stint as a typesetter, claimed Alcala shared some of these photos with his co-workers. She recalled thinking it was weird, but that she was young and, quote, didn't know anything. When I asked why he took the photos, he said their moms asked him to. I remember the girls were naked, end quote. How sick and chilling. One woman who allowed Alcala to photograph her said that his portfolio also included, quote, spread after spread of naked teenage boys, end quote. Again, just sick and disgusting. But also interesting because he showed interest in a different gender and age bracket than most of his murder victims. Alcala faced more charges for assaulting and strangling 5 women in California in the late 1970s. Alcala made the totally sane decision to represent himself during these court proceedings and was subsequently found guilty of all 5 murders. Such a psychopath move. Again, shout out to Ted Bundy for doing the same thing. Alcala actually died earlier this year, on July 24th, 2021, at 77 years old while awaiting his execution. Ironically, this was the same date as his final arrest. I hope you've enjoyed our time here together today. Thank you for listening to The Psychology of Murder. If you have suggestions for topics you want me to cover in future episodes, please let me know. I love to hear your feedback. Until next time, I'll hear you later.